Julie, thank you so much for having me today and for My Jewish Learning having me here. And I'm excited to be learning with all of you about From Judeans to Jews, which might seem a little less relevant for Hanukkah, but as we will see together as we explore this topic, it is not just relevant for the Hanukkah story, but is relevant to our Jewish identity today. And we're going to really see how our Jewish identity comes from this Hanukkah story that creates this December dilemma, and yet while it creates the December dilemma, creates who we are also as the Jewish people today. I'm going to share my screen on and off today, or at least more on, to be honest, than off. So I'm going to start sharing my screen, and I hope you can all see it. So we're going to start from Judeans and Jews. While I'm sharing my screen, we're not going to be having a conversation necessarily, but I want you to think of these questions that I'm asking on these screens, and I'm going to give you some answers and everything, but I want you to think of some of the questions as well as we're going through these stories and we're going through these texts to really embrace the idea of thinking of what these questions mean to you as a Jew if you're Jewish, and mean to you if you're not Jewish, what you think it would mean to those who are Jewish in your lives. So the first question I have is, what makes Jews Jewish today, right? What makes Jews Jewish? And if you ask this question a lot of times, and I've asked it many, many times in the course of my studies on Jewish identity, I've asked it in many of my classes, a lot of people will say, that's a great question. How do you answer that question, right? Is it the Torah? Is it the fact that we have matrilineal descent in the conservative and Orthodox movement, but we have patrilineal or matrilineal descent in the Reform movement? Is it the fact that we have certain traditions in common, like Shabbat on Saturday? What is it that makes us Jewish? Where is it that connects us and the strands that connect us? As a Jewish historian, I would say the strands that connect us is the fact that we can actually see how we ebb and flow throughout history. And we have a chain of events that take us from biblical times all the way to the current times that we live in today. And we're going to see that story. But we also have this very confusing story, right? Like the story of like, are we a religion? Are we a nation? Are we an ethnicity? Are we a race? Are we a culture? Is it an identity of all these things together or some of these things? Where is it really? And the reality is all that confusion and all those questions come from this era of the Hasmonean time period, the Hasmonean dynasty, which is the era of the Maccabean revolt. All these questions come from this time period. So when I say this time period, we're talking about before the Common Era, right? So BCE, and we're talking from about 167 BCE to about 141 BCE, which is during the Maccabean revolt. And we find that the Hasmonean Empire really starts from 141 BCE until the end of the Common Era, when the Hasmonean Empire is destroyed by the Romans, and we no longer have a Jewish state. But before we get to that part of the story, we really need to step back in time a little. So that's a little bit of that question. So I want you to think about that as we go through this story. Let me step back. Okay, so we have Proto-Judaism. And when we say Proto-Judaism, we look at the story of Ezra, and we're not going to read the text today because I want to really get into the Hanukkah story. But if you ever look at the books of Ezra, and you look at the book of Ezra 9, 1 through 15, it looks at the idea of intermarriage, and it bans intermarriage, and it talks about this concept of the holy seed. And what it does is it solidifies a people. When you ban intermarriage, what it says is it says there is an us, and if there's an us, there has to be a them, right? And if you have an us and you have a them, and you say there can't be intermarriage, you're protecting the us. Now, it also says in Ezra 9, 1 through 15, that there is patrilineal and matrilineal descent. Now, remember, just a few seconds ago, I said in Orthodox and Conservative Judaism, there's matrilineal descent. In Reform Judaism, there is matrilineal or patrilineal descent. But during the time of Ezra, there is matrilineal and patrilineal descent, meaning both the parents have to be of Bnei Yisrael, right? Both the parents have to be of these people. But it's a Proto-Judaism. It's not Jewish yet. And this is a concept that sometimes when you hear this concept really bothers the Jewish people. It's like, what do you mean we're not Jewish yet? We've already dealt with Moses. We have the temple. Why are we not really Jewish? And we're going to get into that story today a little. A lot of the concepts that we're going to be dealing with today come from Shia Cohen, who is a very learned professor who looks at Jewish identity. And some of the time people have a really hard time looking at these concepts and embracing these concepts. And that's totally fine. If you, and from a traditional perspective, it's completely understandable. So we're going to be looking at it from a historical perspective today. So just understand that as we're exploring this topic today, we're really looking at it from a historical perspective. Okay, so we're going to start with a peoples called Judeans. So the term Judeos or Judaeus, depending if it's the Greek or the Latin, can also be in Hebrew Yehudim, right? And Yehudim generally translated nowadays would be translated into what? Jews, right? But back in the book of Maccabees, and there are 4 books of Maccabees, it can be translated into a different term. And that different term that it can be translated into is actually Judean, a people defined by the land of Judah, that they live in a physical space. So I, Yael Weinstein, am an American. Why am I an American? Because I live in the physical space of America, right? My mother is Israeli. She actually lives in America now, so she's also American. But she's Israeli. Why? Because she was born in Israel, and she is of Israel, right? She is of the Israel space. So what happens is a Yehudi, back in the time of the Maccabees 1, would be a Judean, somebody of Judah, of Judea. And we're going to see how that Judean term, that of the land, becomes not Judean, but Jew, not of the land, but of a belief system. And we're going to see how that looks. So we're going to stop the PowerPoint share, and I'm going to read to you our first text. Melton, Adult Jewish Learning, is all about reading text-based learning. And so we're going to look at text together today. You're going to hear me read. I hope you don't all get tired of my voice. I apologize if you do. There are, as I was saying, there are 4 books of Maccabees. They are not in the Tanakh, which is the Jewish Bible. They are in the Septuagint, which is the Greek version of the Bible. There are 24 books in the Tanakh. The book of Maccabees are part of the Apocrypha. It tells you that they're not as significant within the Jewish canon, within the Jewish tradition, within the Jewish story. And if you think of the Hanukkah story, you have to think about the fact that we hear of the miracle before we hear of the Maccabees, right? Or when we hear of the Maccabees, we always hear it in conjunction of the miracle. Today, we're not going to be talking about the miracle as much. We're going to be hearing about the defilement. We're going to be hearing about the Maccabees. We're going to be hearing about Simon. We're going to be hearing about Judah. But we're not going to be talking as much about this 8-day miracle. We're going to be really talking about a war and a civil war between the Judean people and how there were the Judeans who wanted to Hellenize, the Judeans who believed in the religion, who wanted to maintain a religion and ended up becoming Jews because of that. We're going to be talking about Judeans who wanted to Hellenize, who were on the side of the Egyptian Greeks, who were the Ptolemies, and those Judeans who wanted to Hellenize, who were on the side of the Syrian Greeks, who were the Seleucids, okay? It gets very confusing, very, very fast. And it's okay if we don't remember dates and times and everything. What's important is to understand that this confusion feeds into the confusion we have today. Don't you love that? That we get to be as confused today as we were like back almost over 2,000 years ago. It's fantastic, right? Okay, so we're in the book of Maccabees 1, 14, 27 through 45. The following is a copy of the inscription. On the 18th day of Elul, so we already have our months in the Hebrew calendar, in 172nd year, that is the 3rd year under Simon the high priest, prince of the people of God, in a great assembly of priests, people, rulers of nation, and elders of the region, the following proclamation was made to us. Since there have often been wars in our country, Simon, son of Mattathias, descendant of Jorib, and his brothers have put themselves in danger and resisted the enemies of their nation. So we have to realize that Simon is the brother of Judah, right? So we're talking about the Maccabees right now. So we often hear, as the Jewish people, we hear of this Judah story, right? We hear of Judah the Maccabee, the strong leader of the war and the revolt. And Simon is the high priest, the leader behind the scenes, who's more in the story, but there is this very strong, but we hear of Judah, the strong leader, often. So what happens in the story is put themselves in danger and resisted the enemies of their nation so that their sanctuary and land might be maintained. And they have thus brought great glory to their nation. Jonathan rallied the nation, became their high priest, and was gathered to his people, but he died. When their enemies sought to invade and ravage their country and to violate their sanctuary, Simon rose up and fought for his nation, spending large sums of his own money to equip his nation's forces and give them their pay. This is not a miracle story yet, right? This is a story of somebody who's a leader who needs to pay his armies, who needs money to fight his enemies. Simon, he fortified the cities of Judea, especially the border city of Beth-Zur, formerly the site of the enemy's weaponry, and he stationed there a garrison of Judean soldiers. Note, it's Judean soldiers, not Jewish soldiers. He also fortified Yaffo by the sea and Gezer on the border of Ashdod, a place previously occupied by the enemy. These cities he settled with Judeans and furnished them with all that was necessary for their restoration. When the people saw Simon's fidelity and the glory he planned to bring to his nation, they made him their leader and high priest because of all he accomplished and the justice and fidelity he had shown. His nation, in every way, he sought to exalt his people. In his time and under his guidance, they succeeded in driving the nations out of their country, including those in the city of David in Jerusalem, who had built for themselves a citadel from which they used to sally forth to defile the environs of the sanctuary and inflict grave injury on its purity. In this citadel, he stationed Judean soldiers, and he strengthened its fortification for the security of the land and the city, while he also built up the wall of Jerusalem to greater height. So he's protecting his city. He's protecting his people. He's strengthening the land. Consequently, King Demetrius confirmed to him in the high priesthood, made him one of his friends, and confirmed great honor on him. This was because he had heard that the Romans had addressed the Judeans as friends, allies, and brothers, that they had received Simon's envoys with honor. So it's really fascinating. When we hear the Hanukkah story often, we think of the Greeks, we think of the Jews, we think of the civil war, this war fought, of the Jews fighting the Greeks to overcome, right, this might. And yet the Romans are also in this story. So we have the Hellenized Jews on the Egyptian side, the Hellenized Jews on the Greek side. We have the religious Jews, or the people who become the Jews. And then we also have the Romans. It's all of these people coming together. This is, you know, we think of the global world today, and yet it was also a global world of the past. So consequently, so we're down here, this was because he had heard that the Romans had addressed the Judeans as friends, allies, and brothers, that they had received Simon's envoy with honor, and the Judeans and their priests had decided the following: Simon shall be their leader and high priest forever until a true prophet arises. He shall act as military governor over them, and he shall have charge of the sanctuary to make regulations concerning its functions and concerning the country, its weapons and strongholds. He shall have charge of the sanctuary, and he shall be obeyed by all. All contracts in the country shall be written in his name, and he shall be clothed in purple and wear a gold buckle. So the priestly colors, right? It shall not be lawful for any of the people of priests to nullify any of these decisions or to contradict the orders given by him or to convene an assembly in the country without his consent, to be clothed in purple or wear a gold buckle. Whoever acts otherwise or violates any of these prescriptions shall be liable to punishment. So what happens in this story is a story not of a miracle, not of yet our candles being lit, but of Judean soldiers, right, who are protecting a city, who are protecting a people, who have a leader, who is being clothed in this beautiful regal royal color, right, with gold, and laws are under him. This is the story we have. This is the start of the Hanukkah experience. This is not the start of the Hanukkah experience you tell your kids or your grandkids, obviously, right? Like, this is not the interesting story to tell your kids and everything. And you might be wondering right now, Yael, what does this have to do with Jewish identity today? So we're going to go deeper into our story. How do these Judeans, how do these people who are defined by law, by a legal system, by a land of which they were born, end up becoming a people of a religion, of a belief system, of a God, not of just a political system, right? We didn't see any mention of God in this story. We saw a conversation of a priest and everything, but there wasn't really God in this conversation. So let's continue on with our story. So let's go back to our PowerPoint. And what we're going to do is we're going to pick up our phones now, okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to go to Mentimeter, and I'm going to share my actual Mentimeter, not that one. So you're going to go to www.menti.com on your phone. So menti.com. And on menti.com, you're going, and I'm going to put it in chat too if you want to do it on your computer. You're going to put in this code 69427308. 69427308. And we're going to have this question: is this attribute more ethno-geographic or religious? I'm going to explain what this is before you answer. As you're typing in things, listen to me, or you can start answering. This is perfect. When you think of ethno-geographic, it means ethnicity and geography define who you are. Your ethnicity and your geography define who you are. If you think of religion, your belief, your God define who you are, right? Your belief system. So when you think of these attributes, is it more ethno-geographic? Is it more religious? Is it more ethno-geographic? Is it more of your ethnicity and your geography? Or is it more of your religion? Let's see what you all think. And you can see as it's changing that people are answering. So we have 4 people already answered. I see that we have about 200 and some people on this, so we'll give a little more time for people to answer. But what we'll see is, what do you think? Is it, and as you're doing this, you can slide the scale, so you can put it closer to ethno-geographic, you can put it closer to religious. But what do you think? How are things defined for people? Are they different? Is ethno-geography really different than religion? Are they very similar to religion? Can you see how one feeds into the other? are they very different, right? So we're going to see that play out now. And while we're doing this, what I want you to think to yourself as well, as we're waiting to see a few more answers, is do you feel that that is different today in 2021? Or is it the same? Is it different in 2021? Is being an American very different? Is an ethno-geographic or a political designation of being a citizen of a society very different than being a religious person and identified in a religious group, right? Is it similar? Is it different? How? So we'll see how it goes. So we have about 55 people. More people are answering. As more people are answering, I'm going to start analyzing this. So we can start seeing geography looks pretty much almost solidly towards that ethno-geographic area, right? That mostly it's of the land, and you can see that curve. This the curvature is most closely aligned to the 1. You can kind of see, isn't that cool how you can kind of see 33 people answered number 1 for geography. By birth, it's a little different. We have 22 people say number 3, that it's kind of in between religion and ethnogeography. And you have to wonder a little bit, is that partially because we are Jewish and we do see this reality of religion being part of that conversation? Customs are closer to religious, okay, for this group, closer to religious, but although 21 are about halfway in, we're now at 21 and 21 at 3 and 4. Institutions, we're at 2.9, so we're about halfway there. Dress is closer to ethnogeographic. Cuisine is a little half, in between. And then God is closer to religious, right? No surprise there that God would be closer to religious. Okay. If you want to continue answering this, you're more than welcome to continuing answering it. I'm going to stop it for now, but thank you for joining me in that exercise of using Mentimeter. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen for my PowerPoint. Okay, so what's in a name is the question. So we have a Judean, we have a Jew, and we have actually a citizen or an ally of the Judean state. So what does that mean? So a Judean is a function of birth or geography. A man or a woman is born to a geographic location. Therefore, they are Judean. A Jew means a function of religion or culture, meaning a man or a woman is connected as a Jew because of a religious or cultural affinity. Now it starts getting confusing, right? Because we are Jews, because we are connected in many, many different ways. I just saw a question that I'm going to answer in just 2 seconds from Laura pop up, and I'll answer that in 2 seconds. It says, Safari says Jews throughout 1 Maccabees 14, not Judeans, and why, and I'll answer that in just a second. And then the last is a citizen or ally of the Judean state, a function of politics, right? So you can be allied politically to a nation, and we're going to see how that comes up. So why is it that in the translation that I use, does it say Judean, but in Safari it says Jews? So the reason is because it says in the Hebrew Yehudim, and often Yehudim is translated straight up as Jewish or Jews, not Jewish, as Jews, or Jew as Yehudi in the singular, without understanding the historical connotation and the historical context of really breaking down when it transitioned from Judean, of a people of the land of Judea, to a group of people defined by their religious identity. And it happens in the next text we're about to read, which is actually in the book of Maccabees 2. So while Safaria does translate it as Yehudim as Jews, I would argue, and other Jewish historians would argue argue that that is an anachronistic definition that should actually be Judean. It should not be Jews. Laura, I hope that answers your question. And we're going to see how that looks. And that is like on one foot the entire lecture. So you can all, I guess, go home now. No, I'm joking. Don't go anywhere. So for consideration, though, while we're looking at it, does the translation of Judean or Jew make more sense in each text is one thing I want you to ask. So Laura, I want you to ask that in terms of the Sephardic text, in terms of all the texts we're looking at. And how would the text read if it were Judean versus if it were Jew? Knowing that Judean means that it's a ethno-geographic definition, right? Versus a religious definition. And the easiest way, really, in terms of the concept of how to really think about it, I believe, when you're looking at this, is if it is easier for you to take out the term Jew and Judean and change it to like American versus, like when you're thinking of, you know, of the people of a land, just to think of it in the concept of a person defined by a geographic location, just to help you with that concept, do that at first and then put in the Judean. Because it's really important to understand that that transition really came. That transition is really important. That transition has really confused us for thousands of years. We literally have conversations about Jewish identity, of are we a people of a nation? Are we a people of a race? Are we a people of a land? Are we a people of a religion? Are we a people of a culture? Because of this conversation from this era of the Maccabees, okay? So now let's look at from Judean to Jew. Let's look at our text and how it changes in the book of Maccabees. So we're going back to our text. And to do that, we're going here. Okay, and we're going to 2 Maccabees 6, 1 through 11. So this was written in Greek during the second half of the 1st century, more than 100 years after the events that it describes, okay? And it appears to be written for the benefit of the diaspora Jews in Egypt, which is under the Ptolemies, primarily to inform them about the restoration of the temple and to encourage them to make the yearly pilgrimage to Jerusalem. So not long after this, the king sent an Athenian senator to force the Jews to abandon the laws of their ancestors and to live no longer by the laws of God. Also to profane the temple in Jerusalem and to dedicate it to Olympian Zeus, and the one on Mount Gerizim to Zeus, the host to strangers, as the local inhabitants were wont to be. This was a harsh and utterly intolerable evil, because the Gentiles filled the temple with debauchery and revelry. They amused themselves with prostitutes and had intercourse with women, even in the sacred courts. They also brought forbidden things into the temple, so that the altar was covered with abominable offerings prohibited by the laws. So let's step back here. We're going to look at this story. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen so we can look at the story bit by bit by bit by bit, okay? So to really understand the story, we're going to have to step back into the 300s BCE. So we have Alexander the Great, who has created this amazing empire, right? Which is why he's called Alexander the Great. And he has solidified his kingdom. And it's in the 330s BCE, 334 to 331 BCE. And he's creating theaters and gymnasiums and polises all around the Greek Empire. And what happens is he does not expect people to convert to his society, but there is an expectation that people give honor to the gods, right? So you can maintain your beliefs in your gods, but you still have to do sacrifices, right? That's the expectation, and that's how it goes. He dies, and the entire Greek Empire ends up in a civil war. And when everything settles, there are 4 major Greek empires. 2 of them standing are the Ptolemies in Egypt and the Seleucids. And the Seleucids are in Syria and Mesopotamia. Judea ends up under the control of the Ptolemies at first until 198 BCE. And then after 198 BCE, it ends up under the Seleucids. Now, interestingly enough, the Ptolemies and the Seleucids are actually connected to each other, right? So, like, they're actually family, they're married to each other. This is the Cleopatra story. We're not going to get into the Cleopatra story today. That's a different story. You guys can look that up and everything. But what happens is the villain of the Hanukkah story comes into our conversation. So Antiochus Epiphanes, have you all heard of Antiochus Epiphanes, right? So Antiochus Epiphanes wants to go into the Ptolemy Empire and defeat it and to take over and expand the Seleucid territory, and attempts to do that. And while he's doing that, the Judeans in Judea are starting to have a civil war. There are 2 rival families, the Onians and the Tobiads. You don't have to remember this. I remember this stuff, so you don't have to. So the Onians are more in line with the Ptolemies, and the Tobiads are more in line with the Seleucids. And they denounce each other to the rivals, right? Because they want to have the power. And where is the power controlled? It's controlled in the priesthood, right? The high priest has the power in this conversation. And so what ends up happening is that they start bribing not secular, but the Greeks for the high priesthood. And Jason of the Onians bribes the Seleucids for the high priesthood, gains the high priesthood, and then is outbid by the Tobiads, with Menelaus taking control. Jason flees and comes back with the religious Judeans, and that is how the fight begins. So the fight ends up actually being 3 different factions of Judeans fighting each other in a civil war. This is Hellenized Jews, so Hellenism is the way of the Greeks, are fighting the Judeans. The term Judaism is literally a foil of the term Hellenism. The way of the Greeks to the way of the Judeans. So Judeans become the way of the Jews because of the way of the Greeks. Literally a response to the way of the Greeks, okay? So what happens during this whole period is that the Judeans religion becomes more important than location, than this ethnogeographic location, start refusing to sacrifice to the temple. And the temple ends up being desecrated. And this desecration is laid out in the book of Maccabees too. And the type of desecration that we see is that there is prostitution and there's intercourse, and things that are prohibited by the Torah are being done, by the law are being done within the temple. It is a complete disregard to the way of the Judean life. And what becomes more important to the identity of the people who love the temple is their belief in God. That becomes more important than the belief in the land, than the connection to the land. And so we continue our story. Let me go ahead and share my screen again, and I'll continue reading. No one could keep the Shabbat or celebrate traditional holidays, nor be called Jew at all. And that is the first time that we see the term Jew, Yehudi, not as a Judean, but really meaning the term Jew in terms of a connection as a term to refer to somebody who is religiously defined as a Jew, rather than geographically defined as a Judean. Moreover, at the monthly celebration of the king's birthday, the Jews from bitter necessity had to partake of the sacrifices. And when the festival of Dionysus was celebrated, they were compelled to march in his procession wearing wreaths of ivy. Following upon a vote of the citizens of Ptolemais, a decree was issued ordering the neighboring Greek cities to adopt the same measures, obliging the Jews to partake of the sacrifices and putting to death those who would not consent to adopt the customs of the Greeks. It was obvious, therefore, that disaster had come upon them. Thus, 2 women were arrested for having circumcised their children, were publicly paraded about the city with their babies hanging at their breasts, and then thrown down from the top of the city wall. Others who had assembled in nearby caves to observe the 7th day in secret were betrayed by Philip and all burned to death. In their respect for the holiness of that day, they refrained from defending themselves. These are people who loved who they are identified as because of their belief in their connection to their identity as a people of a belief system, of a religious system. That is what is so important to who they are. They are willing to die for the belief system. They are willing to die for their belief system without defending themselves, right? Because it would desecrate their holy day. They are Jews before they are Judeans. They are of the people of a Torah, of a law of God, before they are of the land. Okay? So we're going now to Maccabees 2:8-1. I'm going to share that and share my screen, and then we're going to go back to my PowerPoint. So then now we hear Judah, right? So we all learn the Hanukkah story, and we always learn about Judah. So here we have Judah. So Judah, also named the Maccabee, and his companions went secretly into the villages and called together their relatives and those who continued to follow Judaism, enlisting a force of about 6,000 soldiers. It was not just important to be who they were of a religious people, but it was now important to fight as a religious people. So they got together 6,000 soldiers to fight on their behalf, to protect and defend themselves against those who would defile their people. And thus we go from Judean to Jew. We go from a people defined by the land to a people defined by religion. So the next question, what does it mean to be of a religious community versus of an ethnic community, right? So remember I said that I would be asking questions that we wouldn't necessarily answer. We'll have some time for Q&A at the end, so you'll have some time to ask some questions. But I want you to think about that. What does it mean to be of a religious community versus of an ethnic community? And sometimes there are things that aren't that different, and we saw that in the conversation that we had with our Mentimeter, right? There are some things that are similar that kind of fall in between, right? Clothing, the way we dress, the food we eat maybe. But then there are other things like God and belief that fall much closer to religion than they do to ethnogeographic location, right? So it depends, but then there are things like law that it really depends where it falls. That at times it can fall in a political identity, in an ethnic identity, and at times it can fall, or a political identity, excuse me, but not really an ethnic identity, right? It's not an ethnicity, really. It's law is a political definition of government, but religion also has law, not just Judaism has law. So there are differences there as well. And how does that come to terms, and how do you see that come about really defines who we are as the Jewish people, because that proto-Jewish identity that is formed prior to this era of 167 BCE to 141 BCE is really important, right? Like all the stories that we read from the Tanakh that define who we are. And I saw somebody mention to me the Babylonian exile in the time of Ezra and the prophets and everything that's in the Tanakh. That's important to who we become as a Jewish people, right? So that's all important. Okay, so this is just to give you a lay of the land of what the Hasmonean Empire looks like. This is actually what the Hasmonean Empire looks like. The red is the outline of modern day Israel plus Gaza and Judea and Samaria. It doesn't have it outlined very well. This is a map from the American Israeli Cooperative Enterprise. But you can see this is where Judea is, the Hasmonean kingdom, all right? It ends up expanding and contracting depending on the time period that it exists, just like every map contracts and expands at various times. So now we're going to look at another text together. So let me share my screen. And we're going to go to Josephus. How many of you have, I can see a lot of you, I can't see all of you because there's 238, so I can see about 49 of you. So of the 49 I can see, how many of you have heard of Josephus before? Okay, very nice. So we have a great bunch of people who have heard of Josephus, at least from the group I can see. So Josephus was born in Jerusalem. He was Jewish. He ends up being a historian for the Romans, right? He ends up also betraying and is seen as a traitor to the Jewish people, and is a very interesting character because people say they can't trust his work, and because he was a traitor, so you have to read Josephus with that knowledge. So that's really important to understand. What's also very important to understand is he is living in the 1st century CE, so the Common Era, not BCE. So he's far removed from our story. So just like when we're reading history and we're writing about history now, he is a historian, right? Like he's not living during this era. So we have to understand that he's not of that time period, and so there are biases that are obviously existing. There's always biases in every story that exists, whether it's written of the time period that is being written of or written of a previous time period, right? There's always some bias that it is in those stories. So just know that as we're reading this story from Josephus. So Josephus' Antiquities of the Jews 13:9 through 1 is the story we're reading today, but I want to take 2 seconds to tell you, by the way, because I focus on anti-Semitism so much. The first blood libel, by the way, comes from the era of Antiochus Epiphanes, and Josephus records it in against Empion. So if you ever are interested in reading about the first blood libel, I would recommend you look up Josephus and the blood libel from there. So that's just a slight off, but it is about the Hanukkah story, so just so you know. So we're on text 4. Hyrcanus also captured the Idumean cities of Adora and Larissa, and after subduing all the Idumeans, permitted them to remain in their country so long as they had themselves circumcised and were willing to observe the laws of the Jews. And so out of attachment to their ancestral land, they submitted to circumcision and to having their manner of life in all other respects the same as that of the Jews. And from that time on, they have continued to be Jews. So this is a story of a forced conversion for political reasons. Back throughout history, not just back in the day, but throughout all historical time periods, conquerors forced people to adopt culture, identity and ways of life to assimilate new populations into their identity. That's how wars worked back in historical times. It's how wars work today. That is a way of controlling populations and evolving populations to conform to the way that the ruling party wants it to run. And this is what happened during the era of the Hasmoneans. So when we think of the Hanukkah story, often we think of the fact that we look at the miracle rather than the Maccabees. We think of Judah Maccabee, but we don't think of the Hasmoneans, right? As often. Like, I think it looks like you're a very learned bunch, so you probably I wouldn't be surprised if you think of the Hasmoneans. But by and large, the Jewish population thinks of the Maccabees and Judah Maccabee, but not necessarily the Hasmonean population, because we, as a Jewish people throughout history, have chosen to minimize the significance of the Hanukkah story that was the war, partially because of who the Hasmoneans became, partially because it was less about the miracle and more about the brutality and the fact that they ended up actually becoming more like the Hellenizers that they were originally trying to not become like. And that was really a lot of where the issues arose about why the books of Maccabees were not included in the Jewish canon and were not included in the Tanakh, okay? So let's go back to here. We're going to skip this because I want to make sure we have time to Q&A. So I want you to think about a few more questions, and these are coins that we're not going to analyze right now. But I want you to think about the question, what does it mean for society to first define itself in contrast to a dominant culture, only to turn around later to embrace it? What does that mean? And interestingly enough, what does that mean in light of the fact that Hanukkah is a holiday that was literally created to represent itself, to remind us as a celebration to define ourselves in contrast to the dominant culture, and yet now has become the symbol of embracing the dominant culture in some ways. And then what do you think is the reason that the canon does not include the book of Maccabees? We kind of discussed that a little, okay? This is the Hasmonean family, just so you know. So if you're interested in seeing the line of the Hasmonean, this is Judah right here. This is Simon. So everybody actually comes from Simon. The family ends up coming from Simon, just so you know. But ultimately, what I want you to think about is that our Jewish identity today gets all messed up because we started as an ethno-geographic group that was defined by Judean. We brought in the religious component and became Jews. And we also brought in the political component, right, where we were willing to convert people into our kingdom. And so we had this ethnic geographic, this religious and this political. And today, as Jews, we have all of these aspects in our identity as who we are. And so we have a 2,000-year-old conversation. What are the lasting impacts of this era on the Jews in terms of identity, tradition, and memory? And those are the things that we need to think about. And those are our enduring understandings when we really consider what it was like for the Judeans who ultimately become the Jews. So the people evolved from an ethno-geographic group to a religious one. Conversion of groups become part of the Jewish experience. And the modern concepts of nationality, ethnicity, and religion stem from this period. So at this point, I would love to open it up to any questions that anybody has.
Okay, thank you so much, Yael. I've opened up the chat box, so folks should be able to send their questions, to everyone so that everyone can see. And if not, I'll pass them on if they come to me. And if there's someone that wants to ask their question verbally, can let us know, use the raise hand function, or let us know in the chat. There was a question here that came in. Where does the Jewish origin story of the Torah fit in to this period?
Yeah, so the Jewish origin story of the Torah fits into the Tanakh. So you're talking about earlier in the context. So we're in right now the BCE period, really right on the edge of CE. And so you're going to have to go back quite farther away, because you're dealing with the fact that in 586 BCE, for example, we already have the destruction of the first temple, right? And prior to that, you already have the creation, you already have the Mishkan, and you have the stories that you find within the Tanakh and everything, or within the Torah. So the dating is interesting. So I'm not going to give you an exact date, because it depends on if you're a historian versus if you are a observant Torah Jew, what dates you would give. I'll leave it at that, because otherwise we could be debating that for the rest of the conversation.
So there were a couple of requests to see that last chart one more time.
The chart from the family?
The enduring understandings?
Oh, sure. Yep, there it is. Would you say that Judaism as a religion is historically a result of losing access to the Judean region? I think that it solidified the Jewish religion for sure, but I think Hellenism, and I was telling this to Julie before everybody came on, it's crazy to think that Judaism, this term Judaism, and we as Jews are literally the response to Hellenism, to the way of the Greeks, and yet this Hellenism doesn't exist anymore, really, right? This society that we responded to doesn't exist, and we have grown and we have thrived since then, and we have an entire society that has expanded beyond what it was originally in 167 BCE. We didn't stop growing back then. So I think that that's really important to understand when you're looking at it. But I think that, yes, as we evolved, losing Judea definitely continued to evolve our religion, but it definitely started from this conversation. Julie, do you mind reading me the questions so that I don't miss anything?
Not at all. And we also have a hand raised, so I'll read. Why don't I read a couple of questions in the chat box, and we'll go from there, and then we'll have Michelle ask her question.
Okay.
Okay. The rabbi has told us that there is biblical Judaism back then, and that we now have rabbinic Judaism. Where do the Maccabees fit within this, or is Proto Judaism the missing bridge between those two?
So there's biblical Judaism, right, which is this which I consider proto-Judaism, really. Then you have the creation of the Judean to Jewish time period that we just talked about. And then around the 1st century CE, you start entering into the rabbinic Jewish time period. But like all time periods, what's really important to understand about history is we like to put everything in a box, right? Like here's my box. I like my box, and everything should fit in it. But that's not how history really works. History bleeds into places, into spaces. And so what ends up happening is that Rabbinic Judaism and Biblical Judaism kind of bleed into each other during the time of the Sadducees and the Pharisees, which is in the era of the beginning of actually like Christianity and everything as well. So it all bleeds in together. And then you have Rabbinic Judaism really solidifying around 200 CE. And then we are living during the era of the Rabbinic Judaism now.
Okay, Michelle, do you want to go ahead and ask your question? Michelle, there you go.
Yes. Hi from Canada. I was wondering, two questions. The first of all, I thought Yehudim meant grateful ones. And second of all, what if you are Gentile as I am, but you identify with maybe not necessarily the culture, but certainly the religious and the faith aspects of Christianity, of Judaism? Does that make sense?
So I think this is a slightly different conversation than the conversation we're having today. So I would say maybe this is an offline conversation that I would be happy to answer. So Julie, if you want Michelle to send me her information and we can talk about it offline, that would be great.
Okay, there was a request to see the family tree again. If you would be able to share it, flip the...
Yes, I can do that. Hold on.
And a question from Emily. Would you say that Judaism as a religion was historically a result of losing access to the Judean region?
So I think I already answered that one, which I was saying is definitely part of the conversation that continued after the start of this foil conversation to becoming responding to the way of the Greeks. So, yeah.
Who did the Hasmoneans, the Hasmoneans later become? And perhaps a related question, what elements of the military victories of the Maccabees remain preserved in the way we celebrate Hanukkah in the 21st century?
So I think the ways that we preserve the victories of the Maccabees has changed since the creation of the state of Israel significantly. Do you mind if I take down the chart now? Is that
great? We'd like to see your face.
Okay, great. So the way that the victories have really changed, and you can see it in the songs that are sung in Israel, like Mi Yimalel, and I won't sing for all of you because then you'll all really run away, is that the strength, the fight, the courage, the bravery really takes center stage, the heroism. And that was not as much the story that the Rabbinic Judaism really put forward in the Talmud. In the Talmud, the story was about the miracle, the 8 nights, the light, the cleaning of the temple, and the sanctification of the temple. So I think that conversation has really shifted with the birth of the state of Israel and with the continued fighting in terms of the Arab-Israeli conflict. So that conversation has really changed, but you can see it today, and that's why it's so fascinating to look at history and seeing how history affects our identity today. It's such a powerful experience to see history breathing life into our own identity in 2021. And I think I missed the first part of that question.
I think the first part of that question was who did the Hasmoneans become?
So the Hasmoneans ended up kind of falling into just the population eventually. They ended up really becoming vassals to the Romans. And there are, stories in terms of there's more. I know we're getting to time and everything, so there's a lot more to the story of how they ended up connected to King Herod and such, and related to King Herod, but eventually they became vassals to the Romans, and then they lost complete leadership. And like many stories of history, we don't have all the details of where their descendants are today.